Hello again, Ken Good-Evanis with Kenny's Carrots, episode number 40 today. And we're looking at the request of God to Abram to sacrifice his son. Think about this. This is the son of promise that Abraham waited so long for. And now God is asking him to go up to a mountain and sacrifice his only son to him. Let's read about it from Christopher Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory. I suppose a subtitle to this particular Kenny's Carrots could be Provision versus Tit-for-tat, or Covenant versus Contract. Here's what Watkins says. In Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 19, God commands Abram to take the child of the promise, Isaac, up to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. This episode exerts a great influence in philosophical and theoretical discourse today, largely through Soren Kierkegaard's reading of the chapter in Fear and Trembling, and also because it is often spectacularly misunderstood. Let us begin by noticing two key literary features of the text. The episode comes with its own meta-discourse, an interpretation of the events within the passage itself. God tested Abraham, verse 1. We know from the beginning that these events are a test. And here's the second literary feature. At the risk of sounding like a first-year undergraduate literature lecturer, we need to pay attention to the repetitions in the text. In this case, one idea is repeated 3 times and twice in rather conspicuously quick succession. Quote, Abram answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Verse 8. We go on. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Verse 14. The take-home message of these events for Abraham is crystal clear. The Lord himself will provide the sacrifice. The reason that this message, God will provide, may not strike us with the force with which it seems to have impressed Abraham is that our expectations of the text are radically different to that of an ancient readership. It is hardly worth asking a contemporary reader what she finds most startling or unsettling about this passage. Of course, we scream in unison, it is the very idea that God could command Abraham to sacrifice his child. We tend to read Genesis 22 ethnocentrically, assuming that Abraham's culture necessarily must have been just like ours. But at a time where the notion of sacrificing children to gods was by no means culturally unknown, this sort of command would appear to be simply the sort of thing that some gods might do. Moloch, or Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, was almost certainly worshipped through child sacrifices, most probably in the form of burning. This practice fit perfectly with the tit-for-tat, N-shaped technical paradigm of religion that we discussed in the previous chapter. If I relinquish something important to me in sacrifice, the God will repay me by giving me something else that I want. Payment leads to reward, the N-shaped approach to things. If it is no great shock that a God should demand a child to be sacrificed, where is the jolt in the passage for the ancient reader? There are two. The first is in the way that God's command to sacrifice Isaac makes no sense in the context of his own promises to provide Abraham with many children, the child through whom the promise of descendants is to be realized. Isaac is that child of promise, supernaturally supplied by God himself. And thus he becomes the child through whom the promise would be fulfilled. So the biblically literate reader is meant to cry out, "What? Why? No, this makes no sense." God appears to be sabotaging his own covenant purpose. The second shock, particularly acute for the ancient reader brought up in an N-shaped culture, is in verses 12 and 13. First, God himself called off the sacrifice. And second, this is where the real scandal lies, God himself provided the lamb. In the tit-for-tat sacrificial arrangements between gods and their peoples in the ancient world, sacrifices were offered to the gods in the hope for something in exchange. They were not provided by the gods. The idea, quote, that God himself will provide the lamb, end of quote, would have made no sense at all within this sort of culture. And it may well have made little sense to Abraham and his descendants until the time when, 2,000 years later, John the Baptist cries out in the desert of Judea, quote, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." John chapter 1, verse 29. It follows that, far from in any way endorsing a culture of human sacrifice, this passage actively and irrevocably subverts it. Precisely because, quote, God himself will provide the lamb. This replaces the N-shaped paradigm of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Sacrifice with the U-shaped dynamic in which God freely initiates relationship with a human being who then responds in the attitude of gratitude. Excuse me. So we go from a N-shaped culture to a U-shaped culture, which we've talked about before. The message to Abraham is that his relationship with God will not be sustained by what he is able to offer God, even if that offering is his only son, the most precious and costly thing he has. No grand sacrificial gesture that Abraham can perform will satisfy God, not even offering his own son. The covenant relationship will be sustained by what God graciously provides. Abraham is not in a market relationship with God, and he has no contract with his maker. Fundamentally, he has nothing to offer God. He is in a covenant relationship of superabundance in which God even provides the animals for his own sacrifice. Abraham's job is simply to keep taking God at his word. And that's where we'll leave Christopher Watkin today. That's your job. That's my job. Whatever we're going through, whatever God asks of us, take God at his word and keep on trucking for him. Come on.